great day, and welcome to today's conversation, We the People, Vote Louder, What the Constitution Means to Me, hosted by the League of Women Voters of the City of New York and BronxNet, your public service multimedia network, broadcasting around the world. We'd like to thank our media partner, ABC7, and our sponsors, Amalgamated Bank, Live On New York, Lyft, and Pure Insurance. These sponsors have made it possible for the League of Women Voters of the City of New York to hand out over 10,000 copies of the U.S. Constitution on the streets of New York, including here in the South Bronx. On Saturday, September 20th, get your copy. Find the locations posted on the League of Women Voters of the City of New York website, lwvnyc.org. As we commemorate 250 years of American democracy this coming year, now is your time to get engaged, keep informed, and share your perspectives.
Each year, the League of Women Voters recognizes Constitution Day, which is September 17th, because that was the day in 1787 that it became the law of the land. We also recognize this day as Citizenship Day, and that it is important to bring that into the conversation about the Constitution. As a special part of this year's Constitution Day, we are having this conversation with young people, including students from Hostos Community College of the City University of New York, to talk about what the Constitution means to you. We hope this spurs on conversations throughout our city.
To facilitate today's conversation, we have two special guests. Heidi Schreck wrote the Broadway play, What the Constitution Means to Me. It is the story of her journey learning about the Constitution when she was young. She signed up to compete in debates hosted in American Legion halls across the country and won prize money to help her to pay for college. Her play won many major awards and nominations and is now streaming on Amazon. Her screenwriting credits also include Nurse Jackie, Billions, and Heidi also wrote and co-executive produced the Joey Soloway Amazon series I Love Dick. She currently has projects with both Warner Brothers, FX, and Prime Video. Ally Coll is an associate professor at the City University of New York School of Law, where she teaches courses about constitutional separation of powers. Her scholarship focuses on how the Constitution affects the advancement of civil and equal rights in the United States. Professor Coll previously worked in nonprofit advocacy, as a litigator in private practice, and as a policy aide on Capitol Hill. She received her law degree from Harvard Law School and her BA in history and political science from Tulane University. A nationally recognized expert on gender equality in the workplace, her writing has been published in the Washington Post, Fortune, PBS NewsHour, Law 360, Roll Call, Bloomberg Law, the Harvard Journal on Legislation, The Hill, and Jezebel. So let's get started. We will ask some general questions about the Constitution, and then we'll look to get a little deeper into what rights the Constitution provides you, to us, and we will finish with what maybe should be added to the Constitution. It's not a quiz. This is a celebration of this document, and we look forward to hearing more about it.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. It's an honor for me to be here with you, actually. So just to be clear, I am not the expert. We do have an expert here. I'm just a person who basically kind of ran a scam in high school to earn scholarship money by traveling around giving speeches about a document that I sort of worshipped at the time, which was the Constitution. And then many years later, I revisited that time doing this contest to kind of see what I'd thought about the document as a 15-year-old girl, and in creating this kind of piece of theater about the Constitution contest I did as a kid, I was kind of forced to learn a lot more about the document and realize the ways in which it had shaped my life in unexpected ways I hadn't fully understand, and also I began to understand the way I maybe had been left out of the document like so many other people. And so I've just ever since then had a real fascination with how this thing that is like, almost 250 years old still shapes our lives. And I want to talk to you all about that to see how you feel about this document, particularly right now. It's an interesting time to be thinking about the Constitution. And I'm so happy to have someone who knows the law so deeply and the history of the Constitution so deeply here to kind of help us out. So the first thing I just wanted to ask, as a kid, when you're giving these speeches, the most important thing to do is come up with a really juicy metaphor for the Constitution, so a living tree or like a house with a leaky roof, or I chose the crucible because I felt like a crucible was this thing, this burning thing in which all these different ideas could come together and then be transformed into something else. And so I just kind of want to open up today by first asking all of you, any of you, what comes to mind when you think of our United States Constitution? Words, images, anything that pops into your head when you think about this document? And I'd love to ask you that question too. So I don't know if anybody wants to start.
A little bit outdated, perhaps?
Yeah.
That's just a key word.
Outdated.
In general, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I like that. I mean, it hasn't been amended for, 50 years or something?
Yeah, there have been attempts, but it's been a while since
outdated
it's happened.
seems fair, yeah. Anybody else, just words or images that pop into your head when you think about this document?
A foundation to build from.
Mm-hmm.
An agreement that we all share.
I love that. An agreement we all share that wasn't created by us, but we do share it. Anybody else have something that comes to mind? Yeah.
I was going to say maybe terms of engagement.
Oh, yeah. That's great. I love that.
The declaration, and also the fact that these people were pioneers. They collaborate together, and they brought something that it speaks to all people, even nowadays.
Mm-hmm. It speaks to all people, even nowadays. What do you think, as someone who studies this deeply?
It's interesting. I'm sure there is a perfect metaphor out there, but the first thing that came to my mind, not having thought about that question before, was the idea of a bulletin board. And I think it speaks to some of the concepts people just raised, but you start with a blank slate, right? The Constitution could have said anything, and then people put forward ideas in the beginning in the drafts, and they're reworked and maybe torn up and rewritten, and then you start with the document that, to the point of it being a shared agreement, just the way that you have signs on the wall in your workplace or wherever that say, here's our code of conduct, or here's how we're all agreeing to behave. It starts out that way, but then we've amended it a lot, and so I kind of envisioned putting pieces of paper on top of some of the old papers to cover them up. And to the outdated point, some of those papers might be really yellowing at this point and old, but some of them are newer and maybe more prominent than others when you take a look at the whole thing today.
I love that. That's great. That makes it feel alive, I guess, too. Which
I think so.
I am curious, I guess, to ask you and everyone here is what, especially today here in 2025, what do we feel like this bulletin board is for? Why do we need it? What does it do for us? Why do we need this bulletin board? I guess I'm curious of what you all think, and obviously what you think.
That everyone is equal towards the law.
Everyone is equal under the law.
Under the law.
Yep. Yeah. Excuse me.
So without the Constitution, without just having our foundation for the law, then we won't have our freedoms and our liberty.
I would say, again, to the point of an agreement and terms of engagement, it's a shared understanding of what we're working from and what we all deserve and how we deserve to be treated by our government.
Mm-hmm. How we deserve to be treated. I'm curious when you think about it, like what are the rights that first come to mind that are guaranteed to us by this document? Like what are the first things that pop into your head?
I mean, I think of representation, the right to just be able to choose who is making decisions for you.
Free speech.
Aha, free speech, yes.
Democracy, freedom, ensured for everybody,
Democracy, freedom, yeah.
pursuit of happiness.
Is there anything you think about like rights that come into play for you like every day, like in your ordinary everyday life?
I'll definitely say freedom of speech, because we on social media, if you post every day, you have a right to, to post what you want to post.
Yeah, right. We can't be arrested for the things we say, for the most part, on social media. Yeah, most of us use that almost every day, right? Our freedom of speech, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to piggyback off of that and say the freedom to protest.
Uh-huh.
Because it's like having the freedom of speech and also having the free will to come together to participate in the vote.
Yeah.
I would also like to add on freedom of speech as well, just that because it allows for the government not to police our thoughts, not to say that there's no consequence for said speech, like anything that can be said can be negatively affected throughout how anyone would, mind mumble. How society would perceive them, but at the same time, that's not like cause for them to be subjugated to oppression by the government.
Right. Yeah.
I think also freedom of speech, and more specifically, the right to criticize the government. The right to criticize the government without being fear of persecution, and the right to ask for change and ask for things to be different. Yeah.
I'm so interested in these answers because I think for me, that's the first thing I think of too, freedom of speech, the right to criticize. It feels to me, ever since I first, I guess, remember learning about the Constitution when I was in junior high, that's the thing I understood was most important to being an American, I guess, was that here you could protest, you could speak out, you could criticize your leaders, and that you understood that that came with no retribution. Now, obviously, I know that hasn't always been true in different communities and different places, but it is always the thing that I think I have held as most fundamental to being an American, and I'm just wondering, I'd love to hear from your perspective about that. It is, in fact, the first thing I think about.
Yeah, well, and it's also the First Amendment,
Right.
right? So I think that's for a reason. I think it's really interesting that was the first thing everybody brought up and that you think about, and I think that was on the minds of the people who wrote the Constitution too, because we were coming from a system of tyranny and a system in which it wasn't safe to criticize the government or speak out. And there's so many components to the First Amendment. You have sort of, as you all mentioned, the idea that you as a citizen can say what you want, to some extent, right, with some limits. But for the most part, you have the right to be free from what we call viewpoint discrimination. So your words can't be silenced because you hold an unpopular view, whatever that might be. But there's also freedom of the press. So the fact that if you read the newspaper in the morning, you are able to choose from a variety of sources and not just get your news from the government. That's a part of the First Amendment as well. Freedom to protest and assemble, to create organizations like the League of Women Voters and associate, freedom of association with other people who share, your same goals and views, and then to go out and organize and share those views on the street. And then, of course, freedom of religion is a part of the First Amendment, too. So I think there was an understanding that for people to both be able to exercise their religious or spiritual beliefs and to do that without the government establishing, one particular religion, even though speech and religion are two different things, the fact they're part of the First Amendment, I think, was just trying to set this strong foundation of freedom of expression and viewpoint. And today, the First Amendment has been interpreted in all sorts of different contexts to, for example, allow for flag burning, or to allow for universities to teach what they want to teach, right? And it's not just all of us that have individual First Amendment rights, but we benefit from the fact that we get to be a part of institutions that also are protected under the First Amendment.
How do you feel like the First Amendment is holding up right now?
I think it remains to be seen a little bit. Where I think, your first question you asked was, what is the Constitution here for? What role does it play? And you all said the idea of creating shared agreements. And what came to my mind, certainly creating shared agreements, but when those are most important are moments when there's a crisis, or there's a boundary being pushed. And, if you go back to my bulletin board analogy, maybe in a workplace or in a community organization, there's a code of conduct that says what you can and cannot do. But day to day, most of us don't necessarily reference that document, right? We go about our lives, we come to school, we go to work, and it's only when something happens where, someone's harmed or someone feels like the rules have been broken that we might go back to that document and say, okay, well, is what happened, okay under our code of conduct, or did we have a violation? And I think the Constitution plays a similar role. And we're certainly in a moment you can see from a lot of the lawsuits being filed across the country where those First Amendment questions are being raised in novel ways. And I think the fact that, different plaintiffs and litigants feel like they are challenging a lot of what's going on right now on First Amendment grounds is evidence of all of the work that amendment was meant to do.
Right. And one of the things, I don't know, that just came up for me when you were talking about that is like another thing that this document was for and is for is to also sort of ensure a balance of power, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like that places where like First Amendment rights are being challenged might be coming from, say, the executive arm or something. Can you talk a little bit about the balance of power and how this shared agreement is meant to work in terms of the three branches of government?
Yeah, I think it's a really important part of the Constitution right now. And a lot of what you all mentioned, and I think what comes to most people's minds when they think about this document is what's contained in the Bill of Rights, right, which are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So the First Amendment is actually an amendment, right? It wasn't a part of the original document. It's one of the first 10 amendments that are mostly rights-giving amendments. So freedom of speech, the Second Amendment gives right to bear arms. The Fourth Amendment gives the freedom to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. So these are liberties and rights. But the foundation of the document, before you get to the Bill of Rights, is a lot about separation of powers and setting up our government in a way that is representative of the people. So a lot of people mention that in the beginning, democracy and the right to participate in selecting who runs our government. That's a lot of what the foundational document is doing. And then it's also trying to create division of power. So we have three branches of government in our federal system. The legislative branch is the branch of government that's meant to make the laws. The executive branch is meant to enforce the laws. So there's a famous part of Article 2 called the Take Care Clause, which gives the president the power to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. So the president is not supposed to be writing the law. Right. That's the job for Congress and the legislative branch. But the executive branch is supposed to enforce the law and make sure people are abiding by it. And then the third branch of government, the judiciary, is supposed to be interpreting the law. And so, I think each of those branches are meant to exercise different functions. And the idea was if too many of those functions are concentrated in one person or even one body, like the Supreme Court or Congress, then we start to look more like a situation with a king, right? We start to look more like a one ruler dictatorship or authoritarian government, and that's what the Constitution was really meant to prevent against. So yeah, the separation of powers was very thoughtful and very intentional, and I think, when you start to see one branch of government exerting more authority than they have in the past, that's where we might look to our Constitution and say, is this what was envisioned, or are we actually supposed to have more checks and balances than we're seeing right now?
Right. I'm curious, like this was obviously one of the first things I learned as a kid about the Constitution was this separation of powers. And I guess it also just makes me think, I am curious where people learn, if you can remember where you first started learning about the Constitution. Like, was it in school? Was it your parents? Like, where did we even get this idea of the shared agreement we're all trying to live under? Does anybody remember when they first learned about it? Yeah.
I remember being a very little kid and my mom showing me the Schoolhouse Rock version and like quizzing me on it, and we would sing along together. And then I knew the preamble. And then I got tested on it in middle school and in high school. But that was definitely where it started.
That's so funny. That's my introduction too, and I'm so much older than you are. I'm really happy that it's still out there. That like I'm just a Bill, and those were good songs. Yeah. Anybody else?
I probably learned about it in elementary school, but really it all sunk in a lot more actually when my children were in high school and rebelling and questioning everything and taking issue with it. And that's when we had a lot more detailed conversations.
Wow.
About what was actually in the Constitution or not.
Yeah.
I guess I was gonna say, I think I learned it early in school, probably like elementary school, and then I did RTC in high school.
Oh,
so
wow.
I had to take, there was a huge part that was civics related with the engineering and stuff in the RTC. But it wasn't until I got to college and I had to take the public administration class. I think that's when we actually went through the Constitution and as far as, the role of the government and put it into, a real perspective.
And do you remember what you started to think about it when you really started examining it that closely later on in life?
Yeah, because actually, it does make sense for, things to have to go through, like she said, with the checks and balances, through a Congress, like a third party, though, to be there so that we can actually, take advantage of the democracy. Otherwise, it would be too much, like, too much power on one side of the government, on one branch of the government. Then it won't have a balance.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. Anybody else have any first memories of learning about it?
I actually remember like starting, like having a little bit more of knowledge of the Constitution around the 2016 election, but then it wasn't until like after I took an introduction of politics and during my first year of college, then that's when I like really delved into like Constitution, like how laws are passed, like the roles between the government and so.
Yeah. And do you remember did your feelings about the document change when you started examining it?
I remember my professor told me the lengths it took to pass a bill, in which case they would change around, like there would also always be compromises between, I think it was the Congress or what, after that it had to pass through the House of Representatives, and after that it had to be signed by the president, and at each step of the way it could always be just like stomped. Right. So it was very much like very hard to pass a bill because of a lot of infighting between it.
Right. Did it feel inefficient to you? Was that like how does anything happen if it?
It felt a lot more convoluted than it needed to be.
Yeah.
Especially with like a lot of compromises and the need to add in some laws just so that it can pass in like more effectively or so.
Right. It's so funny. My dad was a U.S. history teacher, and he was always trying to sell me on this idea that like the inefficiency was actually its beauty. Like how hard it is to get anything done is what keeps us from like, spinning off into one direction or another. And I always sort of took that as gospel until I started questioning everything my dad believed. But I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I do teach that in my classes, that it's by design, that it's supposed to be hard for Congress to get things done because we want, in order to preserve freedom, the idea was we should only have laws that are really necessary, right? People should be able to go about and live their day-to-day lives unless there's some serious reason why we need to encroach on their freedoms or their liberties. And so, yeah, I do believe it was by design to make it hard to get things done. But it's really important to remember that society has changed so much since this document was written. And so, although parts of that were by design, I think today some of the gridlock we see in Congress was not by design and is a function of how lots of laws and different dynamics about redistricting, for example, they've affected the makeup of Congress. The way we consume media information has led to more polarization. So I think there are ways in which it's hard to get things done in Congress today that maybe the original authors of the Constitution wouldn't have imagined, but I do think parts of it were by design.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, first of all, yes, that's interesting that it's become perhaps harder than they ever could have imagined, particularly because of the polarization, but it's also interesting that that it was designed to be essentially conservative, right? To not move quickly, which on the one hand, that makes sense to me. Everything you're saying about it sort of protects us all for it to move slowly, assuming that the document in the first place was designed to protect all of us, which, as we know, it actually wasn't. And so it feels like, I guess I am interested, and maybe this was part of my own discovery process and working on the play, sort of realizing how much I had believed that the document included all of us and was that we were all equal under the eyes of the law, and then really understanding that wasn't really true at first. And so, and this is a debate at the end of my play, is a document that was written so long ago and actually specifically it was specifically made sure that we were not all equal. Is that something that, is it evolving to quickly enough, I guess, to really take into account our modern world? And is it, sorry, I'm being a little inarticulate, but I guess is it, the debate at the end of my play is always should we abolish it and start over, given that it was actually born out of inequality, given the fact that our country was started, with the original sin of slavery. How much would this document have to change to actually include all of us?
Yeah, it's a great point. Not only is it supposed to be by design hard to get legislation through Congress, but it's also really hard to amend the Constitution, even harder, right?
Yeah.
That's a really high threshold. And to your point, if you're starting out with a flawed document that needs to be amended just to get it to baseline neutral, maybe that's not the right system, right? Maybe we need to start with a document that accurately reflects the society that we see today and then amend it from there as needed as society evolves. When you asked about first learning about the Constitution, I hadn't thought too much about that question, but I really think it wasn't until I went to law school that I learned the extent to which the constitutional system left people out all along the way. I knew some of it in maybe high school and college, but it wasn't until I started reading Supreme Court cases interpreting the Constitution, some from before the Civil War and then many after, that I realized just how deeply, inequalities have been baked into the system from the beginning. And I think that's something I wish more people were educated on earlier, because you shouldn't have to want to be a lawyer to understand this document, which affects us all so much.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit, certainly at least when I was a kid in the 80s, so it was a long time ago, but it was certainly all people are created equally is something that's baked into you. And if you're if you're a white girl living in Washington State, you're yes, absolutely, we're all equal. And then you sort of begin to realize that that's not how it works.
And even with the amendment process, so the 14th Amendment was passed after the Civil War, and it includes the Equal Protection Clause, which is where we get the language that, you can't be discriminated against by the government on the basis of race or sex or other protected categories. But that wasn't in the original document. It took a civil war to enact that amendment. And then for many years, even after, we had that explicit language in the Constitution that said, by equality, we don't just mean white men, we mean, everyone. even after that language, we had segregation for decades that was upheld under that clause. The Supreme Court looked at that and said, okay, equality, but separate is equal. Separate can be equal, right? So it's just so interesting the way we may even amend the Constitution, put down the words that we think have the meaning we want them to have, and it's always subject to interpretation by the Supreme Court, by the President, by Congress, and it can take a long time for even those words to take the kind of effect that they were maybe meant to have, or that people, you know, envisioned when they fought a war over it and meant true equality, and yet for a long time we didn't. You know, and in many ways today we still don't have that, right?
Right, right. Yes, it's very interesting, the transforming understanding of what equality means and what under the law means and all of that. I am curious, like the other thing I sort of discovered working on my play was this idea that constitutions, well, we have very old constitution, right? And that constitutions written in the 20th century are often rooted in this thing called positive rights, I guess. So they often include things like the right to clean air, the right to climate justice, and things like that. Lots of things that our document does not include. And I just wondered, it sort of made me think about, like, I would be curious, like, if we were rewriting it now, or if we could amend it, if it were a little bit easier to amend this document, like what amendments you all would want to have in there, if you've thought about, if you could amend it, what you might want to put. And I have that question for you too. What amendment would you want to pass? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I would definitely amend the Constitution. I'm sorry. I would definitely amend the Constitution to include, the digital privacy laws, so that people can be protected when they're online, especially from being, having their privacy being invaded by law enforcement and the government.
Yeah. Yeah, talk about something they never could have imagined 250 years ago, right? That's a great one. Yeah.
Well, we were talking about learning about the Constitution, and when I really learned about the Constitution for the first time was in like high school AP government. And one of the other things I learned was about the Equal Rights Amendment, and I was a young feminist, and that really pissed me off. Just that women are still not explicitly included, and I think that feels like such a basic one.
Yeah.
To include.
Yeah, I'm sure that this amazing organization talks about this a lot. But when I was doing research, when you poll Americans, a lot of people think it is in the Constitution. They already think it's in there, which I find fascinating. Like, it's so, in fact, at a base level, uncontroversial that it's fascinating that, it's horrible that it's not in there. Yeah. Yeah.
In keeping with our 21st century landscape and technology, strive and thrive algorithm, or healthier algorithms to kind of keep us civically engaged and aware, and could be interesting things like that, thinking about our common values or things that and contribute to more empathy and understanding, as we reflect on laws, future forward laws.
I'd like for me personally for there to be like some sort of protection for immigrants in general. Yeah. I know that maybe my memory may be hazy, but I know that there is maybe some clause that says like anyone within the land like has rights within it. But I think it would be better if it was officially recognized, because I know there are many bad actors who would look at that clause that I was talking about initially and just like try to dismiss it about it being like before times, or they weren't actually like meaning about them. So if there was like some form of like officially recognizing them, it would just help a little bit better.
That's a great one. I have that question for you, because it's my understanding that due process is guaranteed equally to people whether you're a citizen or not a citizen, but I don't know if my understanding of that is, I'm curious. That's how I was always taught, that like we have a right to due process under the law regardless of our immigration status, and I don't know if that's true.
Yeah, well, the due process right has a lot of exceptions to it, right?
Okay.
So for example, right now at the border, even if you are a citizen. There are exceptions to the Fourth Amendment at the border. If you are entering or leaving the country, you can have, your items searched, for example. And there's lots of national security exceptions that end up coming into play in the immigration context as well. So even if there is this kind of basic right, there have been moments where those due process rights or your freedom from, unreasonable police searches or seizures can be encroached upon by the government.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, that makes me think it would be great to have an amendment that more specifically guaranteed rights to people, because I feel like there's what you're describing sounds like there's a lot of room for abuse, I assume, of the due process clause. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, when you ask about, what amendments I think are needed, I think the due process clause and the equal protection clause probably both need a little bit of updating and more rigor to them.
Yeah.
So, I was just looking up here, the equal protection clause language says, no state can deny to any person the equal protection of the laws. And that sounds straightforward and broad, but actually it's been interpreted in ways that maybe aren't as far-reaching as that statement might imply. For example, we talked about the Equal Rights Amendment. I think the reason a lot of people think maybe it's been passed is because we do have the Equal Protection Clause, and it does give you some rights to, protest sex discrimination, but it's not on it's on an uneven standard to other, other types of discrimination. For example, discrimination on the basis of race gets what's called strict scrutiny from the Supreme Court, whereas discrimination on the basis of gender gets intermediate scrutiny, so a little bit of a more forgiving review. And the reason for that is, an understandable reason, which is the 14th Amendment came out of the Civil War and was really about addressing the evils of slavery. And yet, because we've never amended the Constitution to include an explicit extension of that for women, for people who are discriminated against for being LGBTQ, for immigrants, for national origin discrimination, the list goes on, right? You maybe need an equal protection clause that's a bit more far-reaching and covers a lot of the basic rights that we take for granted today.
Yeah.
The due process clause also has been interpreted over the years to include a lot of what sometimes are called substantive due process rights, like the right to privacy. Somebody mentioned that. That's been interpreted to actually be a part of due process, to say not only do you have the opportunity to be heard before the government deprives you of life or liberty or property, but also you actually have the right to keep the government out of some of your business. So that's the right under which same-sex marriage has been recognized by the Supreme Court. That's also the right under which abortion rights used to be recognized before the Dobbs decision. And so I think actually codifying a right to privacy, for example, into the Constitution so that it's more explicit and not read in through the due process clause is important to protect some of the rights that we all maybe take for granted today.
So making it its own amendment, potentially.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's any other amendment you would really want to pass? If you could put anything in there.
Anything in there. I think because the "we the people" language, we all know now did not include "we the people," and I think about indigenous peoples who are living on this land before the people who wrote this document ever arrived, not included in "we the people," and obviously people who were subjected to slavery and women and so many people who make up our amazing country today were excluded. I think we need to rewrite the preamble, even if it's more symbolic and not that the words need so much changing. I think that should be rewritten by people who mean "we the people" is all of us. I think that's really it cuts at the integrity of the document when you know that these kind of founding words ring hollow today, even if it's been amended and even if we've tried to account for that. I think some rewriting of that would be important.
I love that idea. That does feel symbolic in a huge way to say we're going to rewrite this now, and specifically with the specific understanding that we are all included in this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that would
and
be very powerful.
And to make sure it's actually written by a diverse group of people.
Yes, yes. I am curious, like, if there, I guess, like, given the moment we're in, if whether people feel like there is, I guess, one is this document going to be enough for the moment we're in, and where, I guess, in relationship to this document, do people feel hope, I guess? And particularly, I guess I asked that question to you, given your work and vocation. But I'm curious how everyone feels, I guess, in this moment.
Well, I definitely feel that the Bill of Rights is, I wouldn't say sacred, but it's definitely one of those things that makes us American, is having the Bill of Rights. It's what gives us the citizenship and why it's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good, it's good, the Bill of Rights. Yeah.
I think to kind of go back to where the conversation started about what it is, I think that symbolically it's a shared agreement. And I think society is just a shared agreement of like everyone agreeing to come together and make lives easier. And as you guys talked about, there are a lot of ways that this document has not included everyone in that, but I do think that symbolically it means something to have a written down agreement that we're striving for equality. I think there are a lot of ways that I'm really not sure it's sufficient. I think, slavery was abolished except for prisoners. And there are a lot of things that are technically, I think, difficult and exploitable right now, but overall I feel like the symbolism of just that we all signed on and agreed to take care of each other is what society is, and that does give me hope.
Yeah, I do agree with her, but I also would like to say, I think the hope kind of diminished as we see, the Bill of Rights, constantly being misconstrued and things like that. And we have a person in power that has felonies and everything like that, but still could be the president. I think it kind of, it dims the hope that people have, because it's we've been having this document around for over 250 years, like you said, and we still are fighting equality. We still are fighting, racist battles, and we're still fighting different discriminations within jobs and things like that. So I think that the hope right now is kind of it's a little shaky when it comes to, the hope in the document, because it's that's a piece of paper, but then also we can't control what people in power say or do.
Yeah.
Going back to the shared agreement, it feels like a lot of us were operating under this sort of shared understanding, and that there are a set of people who've decided to game it and figure out ways to get what they want, on the assumption that, and not operating under the same understanding and end goals. And I'm sure that always existed, and there are people who've done it over the years, and we've come through these things before, but it feels very, that there are just a lot of bad actors who would just assume, take advantage for themselves, as opposed to this wonderful high ideal that brought, my entire family to this country, and so many people with the view of making things better than they had been before.
Right. If some people just choose to completely ignore the shared agreement and run roughshod over it, what happens? Yeah. I'm curious, I guess, how you feel.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of the, comments that everybody has made, and I resonate with a lot of them. I think, we talked about the First Amendment a lot, and I think the question of how well this system and this document holds up depends a lot to the extent that people still feel free to exercise the rights that are given to us under the Constitution, for example, under the First Amendment. And I think, when citizens see things happening from their government that they think are wrong or violate this document, I think this is a moment where it's not enough to say the Supreme Court will figure it out, right? No, we need civil society to exercise, we need to be educated about the Constitution, which is why Constitution Day is so important, and we need people to assemble and protest and speak up. And I think if those things happen, and if the First Amendment and the other amendments in here continue to do their work, we're going to be okay. But I think that if people accept the idea that because there's intimidation around doing that, we are better off not doing that, that's where I start to lose my own hope, right? I think that we need to believe in these rights and that they're going to be protected. And I completely understand why that's scary, right? And especially depending who you are, and what risks you might have in this moment. It may not be something you personally can do, and I think that's okay. I think everyone has a different role to play, and I don't think people need to necessarily, do things that are going to put themselves or their families at, for example, risk of deportation or something like that. But I think that those of us who do have a platform and an ability to remind others about not only our rights, but our responsibilities under the Constitution to protect the system that we have. I think if people still do that and we can come together and find ways to keep those conversations happening, I think that's how we will continue to make this document one that is a shared agreement, that's listened to, and also that's evolving. I heard somebody say recently, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it does often rhyme, which I really liked that because I think there are moments that, we haven't been in this exact moment before in history, but we've certainly been in other moments of great challenge and struggle, and learning what we can from civil rights movements of the past and putting those tools into practice. We did not get the 14th Amendment easily, or the 15th Amendment, or the 13th Amendment. And we did not get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 without people losing their lives, and that shouldn't be necessary to create change, but being inspired by the fact that things have been really bad before and people have made progress and made that change, and remembering we all have the power to do that, I think is really important.
Thank you. That inspired me. Thank you. And I love that. Woo! I love that it sort of circled back around to maybe in this moment really thinking about the First Amendment as perhaps our most important right is really powerful. If you are don't stop speaking up, don't stop going into the streets. And the truth is it's happening. It's been some of the largest protests we've ever seen in this country have been happening. So it's exciting to remember we have that right and people are using it, and that if we are in a position to use it, we just got to keep doing it. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you all. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much for your participation. This conversation today has been amazing and outstanding. Another round of applause for Professor Ally Coll and Heidi Schreck. Thank you for being prime movers today for this important conversation on Vote Louder, what the Constitution means to me at BronxNet. And BronxNet is your open work. Civic engagement's important. Speaking with your elected officials are important. Getting to know the issues and where you stand on them. And protecting our rights is most important. And that's why BronxNet's so proud to partner with the League of Women Voters of the City of New York.
Woo! And we are a 105-year-old organization that is about giving the information to New Yorkers that they need to be civically engaged, to be a part of their government, to be a part of their community. Our website that you mentioned, lwv.org, we have all kinds of resources, not only about voting, about how to reach your elected representatives and how to get engaged in your community. And it's available in every different language. I want to take the opportunity to thank BronxNet for enabling us to be here today and encourage you to come out and join us on Saturday, September 20th. We are going to be handing out thousands of copies of the Constitution across locations across New York City. We like to go to low voter turnout areas, and we need, not only should you come on out and pick up your copy of the Constitution, you can go on our website right now and sign up to volunteer with us and come out and be a part and help your fellow New Yorkers know about those rights, understand them, and have their own personal copy of the Constitution.
And the conversation continues in our hearts, in our homes, in our communities, and on our channels. And freedom of the press is part of that First Amendment. So know that you can participate in your community media channels at any level you'd like. So let's keep connected and strong, all city. And we'll see you on Constitution Day on September 20th.